Day 54 in Iran, and while there has been no significant change in the hostage situation, there has been a major development in the country next door to Iran, Afghanistan, where the pro-Soviet regime has been replaced by a government even more friendly to Moscow.
50,000 heavily armed Soviet troops have crossed the border and are now dispersed throughout Afghanistan, attempting to conquer the fiercely independent Muslim people of that country.
We had been trying for 100 years to handle Afghanistan, and we failed.
It is the year 1979. Since the end of the Second World War, the United States has been entrenched in a battle of conflicting ideologies known as the Cold War. Its opponent was the Soviet Union, a massive country built on what appeared to be a burgeoning communist economy. Battlefields rose from the dense jungles of Southeast Asia to the steep slopes of the Korean Peninsula. Nations around the world leaned to one side or the other, with enormous pressure to fall under the influence of one of the world's two great superpowers.
Working together to produce an ever greater abundance of material and spiritual values for all. That is the secret of American prosperity.
Since the 1950s, Afghanistan has appeared to be on the side of the Soviet Union. 6 years ago, USSR-backed Mohammad Daoud Khan seized control and declared himself the president of Afghanistan. But in only a few short days, the Soviets have disposed of him and put in a puppet government to ensure their control.
The vast majority of nations on earth have condemned this latest Soviet attempt to extend its colonial domination of others.
In reaction, the United States put pressure on the Soviets by arming Afghan insurgents, fueling the conflict and forcing the Soviets to push harder and dig themselves deeper. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan represents a critical turning point in the Cold War, prompting covert American involvement and leading to the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, the fall of communism, and the emergence of the United States as the lone world superpower. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan horrified the international community. It appeared to be an imperialistic move, one nation spreading its ideals onto a sovereign state when they were not welcome. As the Cold War framed this conflict, fear of communist expansion ran high in the U.S. However, the United States could not publicly intervene due to anti-Western sentiment in the Middle East. Therefore, any U.S. involvement would have to be done in secret.
It is entirely true that this was a war that was fought with our gold, but with their blood.
Unable to fight the Soviets themselves, the United States, through the CIA, gave support to those who had to, the Afghan insurgents or Mujahideen. Operation Cyclone, as it was called, cost the CIA billions of dollars and became one of their longest-running campaigns since their establishment. A major part of their plan was to arm the Mujahideen with anti-aircraft Stinger missiles.
The purpose of coordinating would be to make the Soviets bleed for as much and as long as is possible.
The Soviets were losing one aircraft per day. One aircraft per day. This drove this into the high-cost arena in a hurry. And as a matter of fact, the impact of these kinds of losses was significant from a number of ways. Not only the hardware losses, but the fact that morale started to go down. Transport pilots wouldn't fly. For a period just prior to the removal, extrication of Soviet forces, Stinger gave Mujahideen a decided edge.
Outside involvement from the United States as well as Saudi Arabia and the United Kingdom ultimately drove the Soviets from Afghanistan. However, the Reagan administration never intended to support the Afghans after their victory, and despite criticism, Reagan chose to leave Afghanistan once the Soviets, sick, demoralized, and defeated, limped from the battlefield and back behind their Iron Curtain. The invasion of Afghanistan cost the Soviet Union an estimated $8.2 billion per year. Though the official Soviet death toll is 15,000, many experts believe this number is false. Upwards of 40,000 Soviet soldiers likely died in action, a number excluding those who died from wounds, murders, sickness, and suicide. Veterans of the war returned home to find that many viewed the invasion as a mistake. Civilians voiced their discontent through underground papers and protests, persisting despite the threat of high treason should they dare to question the government.
The funeral was very quick. They buried him, and that was it.
If a soldier comes home, everybody in his village knows. If a coffin comes home, the whole region knows. And that built up. It was the people in the countryside. They surprisingly began to write in. They wrote in hundreds, thousands of letters to the party, to the newspapers, which were referred to the military leadership and the political leadership.
Soviet civilians saw the pointless brutality of the conflict and questioned the necessity of a war when the country was already in dire economic straits. A Soviet joke said one of the 6 wonders of the Soviet world was, "Nobody works, but everyone is paid." Russian economist Grigory Yavlinsky found that Russian miners were not working because they had no incentive to. Depending on the source, at least 1/3 of the country's total industrial output went to the military. Civilians were asked to work for a war they did not believe in, feeding the frustration and discontent of over 250 million people.
How do you feel about the rise in prices?
It's useless. You should listen to their speeches. It's shameful.
You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Perhaps you're going to die. And for the sake of what? For the sake of a system that lies to you? For the sake of a system that turned my father and all our parents into alcoholics?
You know, it's so bad, you know, like...
You suddenly realize that you've been brought up in a system which only creates evil.
It is dangerous to start a storm in our country. If you lose control, you may get into a lot of trouble.
Economic stagnation prompted Soviet leaders, especially Mikhail Gorbachev, to give the people a serious push toward productivity. But the final nail was in the coffin, and Gorbachev's plan to get the people of the USSR to work again by allowing private and cooperative trade as well as private manufacturing quickly gave way to revolution. The Soviet Union could not recover from failure in Afghanistan. Too much money and morale was lost to satiate the needs of its people. In the end, Afghanistan dealt the final blow to the already weakened empire.
It was our Vietnam syndrome. It was impossible for a great superpower to run away from this wild country like the Americans in Vietnam. It would damage our prestige.
Efforts to recover fell flat, and when censorship loosened with Gorbachev's new plan, the message became clear. Collapse was inevitable.
I am obliged to resign as President of the USSR.
In only a few short years, the Soviet Union would dissolve, leaving the United States the lone world superpower. Left on its own, it appeared that America would dominate the globe both politically and economically. An era of relative peace followed, during which the United States enjoyed economic prosperity for nearly 10 years.
That night, the red flag of the Soviet Union was lowered for the last time. In Washington, Bush made his Christmas broadcast.
For over 40 years, the United States led the West in the struggle against communism and the threat it posed to our most precious values. This struggle shaped the lives of all Americans. It forced all nations to live under the specter of nuclear destruction. That confrontation is now over.